أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة في الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. Today we'll be discussing connectionism and looking at Joaquín Fuster's concept of cognates, which is similar to what he speaks about. And we'll be looking at cognitive functions such as perception, attention, memory, language, and intelligence. And along with this, some interesting concepts such as freedom. So, first and foremost, I will discuss this paper by Joaquín Fuster concerning cognates, and we'll see some similarities between this and, of course, the theory of connectionism and also relevant literature. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. A cognate, a network model of cortical representation. This is from 2006, almost 20 years ago. A prevalent concept in modular models is that there are discrete cortical domains dedicated more or less exclusively to such cognitive functions, such as visual discrimination, language, spatial attention, face recognition, motor programming, memory retrieval, and working memory. Most of these models have failed or languished for lack of conclusive evidence. Interesting. Let's read this again. The prevalent concept in modular models is that there are discrete cortical domains dedicated more or less exclusively to such cognitive functions as visual discrimination, language, spatial attention, face recognition, motor programming, memory retrieval, and working memory. Most of these models have failed or languished for lack of conclusive evidence. Okay. In their stead, network models okay, 1 second. Network models are predicted on, sorry, in their stead, network models are emerging as more suitable and productive alternatives. Network models are predicted on the basic tenet that cognitive representations consist of widely distributed networks of cortical neurons. Cognitive functions, namely perception, attention, memory, language, intelligence, consist of neural transactions within and between these networks. I'm going to make a note of this actually. Right, so neural networks attempt to define essentially cognitive functions, okay, and this consists of neural transactions within and between networks, so nodes. The present model postulates that memory and knowledge are represented by distributed, interactive, and overlapping networks of neurons in association cortex. So Foster states model that postulation would be claim, yeah, I would say assume, suggest the existence, fact, truth, reasoning, ecclesi- ecclesiastical. So things suggested. Reasoning, discussion. Okay. So Foster states that memory and cognition, okay, memory and knowledge are represented by distributed, interactive, overlapping networks of neurons. So this is similar to what we find in connectionism, that memory and knowledge are represented by distributed, interactive, and overlapping networks of neurons in association cortex. So I think he states this in his book as well. Association cortex. Association cortex. Let's pull it up here. '33. In brain evolution, the greatest neocortical expansion takes place in an areas called of association. So now Foster is explaining this in his book. In brain evolution, the greatest neocortical expansion takes place in areas called of association, which serve the higher cognitive functions, that is, those functions that deal with knowledge and memory. Naturally, they deal as well with neural transactions between organism and the environment that depend on those functions. Okay, so we need to add a note here. Neural transactions, okay. Neural transactions between the organism and environment. So we will see ontogeny, which is the origin evolution, and then we'll see phylogeny. Phylogeny is how the organism reacts to the environment and how certain characteristics come up and cognitive functions and so on and so forth. That is those functions that you In the human brain, there are two separate cortical functions with areas of association. In the human brain, there are separate cortical regions with areas of association. One is the posterior part of the brain, extending over large portions of the parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes, PTO region, which contains network of knowledge, memory, cognates acquired through sensory systems. So apparently, memory is linked with the idea of cognates, as we will see. Okay, those networks or cognates serve the highest aspects of cognition, including perception, language, and intelligence. The other associative region is the prefrontal cortex. The other associative region is the prefrontal cortex, the association cortex of the frontal lobe, which serves the executive aspects of cognition, especially temporal organization of actions in the domains of behavior, language, and reasoning. This executive cortex develops maximally in the human brain. Okay, where it occupies nearly one third of the totality of the neocortex. So, neocortex is the most developed human brain. Okay, so we will see here man. Relative size of the prefrontal cortex with respect to the total cortex in six animal species, marked shading of external and internal hemispheric surface, PTO, parietal, temporal, occipital association region. Primarily on the basis of morphological imaging data, it has been argued that the prefrontal cortex does not evolve more in proportion than other cortical areas, whereas this may be true volumetrically for the entirety of the frontal cortex. It does not take into account the fine structures. So this is key. It does not take into account the fine structures of cells and fiber connections that characterize the prefrontal cortex per se. In the primitive, in the primate, anyhow, the frontal region, the association nuclei of the thalamus innervae, which we call the prefrontal cortex, considerably exceeds in size the region they innervate in the posterior perceptual cortex. Jones, Levitt, and Walker. Further on, cyto, further on, Kaito architectonic grounds. Further on, chirotectonic grounds. The prefrontal cortex, which roughly corresponds to what Brodmann called regional frontalis, that is, all frontal areas minus 4 and 6, constitutes by scale calculations 8.5% in the lemur, 11.5% in the gibbon, and the macaque, 17% the chimpanzee, 29% the human total cortex. On this basis alone, it seems legitimate to speak figuratively of an evolutionary prefrontal explosion in the human. So I'm going to say for now, conclusive evidence is weak. Okay, right. Going back to the paper here. Such networks, namely cognates, constitute the basic units of memory and knowledge. The association cortex of posterior post-Rolandic regions contains perceptual cognates. Cognitive networks the association of cortex the association cortex of posterior post-Rolandic regions contains perceptual cognates. Cognitive networks made of neurons associated by information acquired through the senses. Conversely, frontal association cortex contains the executive cognates. Conversely, frontal association cortex contains executive cognates made of neurons associated by information related to action. Conversely, frontal association cortex contains the executive cognates made of neurons associated by information related to action. In both posterior and frontal cortex, cognates are hierarchically organized. Okay, interesting claim here. At the bottom of the organization, that is in parasensory and premotor cortex, cognates are small and relatively simple, representing simple percepts or motor acts. At the top of the organization, in temporal, parietal, and prefrontal cortex, cognates are wider and represent complex abstract information of perceptual or executive character. Posterior and frontal cortex networks are associated by long reciprocal cortical connections. These connections support the dynamics of the perception action cycle in sequential behavior. Posterior frontal associated. Okay, this is an important distinction being made here. Posterior and frontal networks are associated by long reciprocal cortical connections. These connections support the dynamics of the perception action cycle in sequential behavior, speech, and reasoning. Okay, right. So let's see here we go. Cognates. We'll quickly run through this and then, well, stuck for it, not quickly, but we'll go through this and hierarchy. And so we have executive representation, perception, action cycle. It is now universally accepted that memory and learning are formed in the central nervous system by modulation of synaptic transmission, in accord with certain principles first enunciated by Hebb. Interconnected neurons and groups of neurons that are excited by stimuli occurring at the same time will be more strongly interconnected than before. In other words, synapses between them will become more conductive. Their membranes more permeable to the impulses generated by any of the temporally associated stimuli. Thus, at a later time, after memory has been consolidated, any of those stimuli is more likely by itself to excite the neurons formerly excited only by the other, now associated stimuli. In this sense, all memory is to some degree associative, and the entire nervous system is capable of associatively storing memory of one form or another. In the cerebral cortex, as elsewhere in the brain, memory is formed by associative synaptic modulations of connections between neuronal assemblies, simultaneously excited, however distant they may be from one another, except for certain aspects of emotional, visceral, and instinctive memory, as well as certain aspects of reflex and automated motor learning. All the memory and knowledge of the individual, all that can be characterized as cognitive memory. In the cerebral cortex, as elsewhere in the brain, memory is formed by associative synaptic modulation of connections between neuronal assemblies simultaneously excited, however distant they may be from one another, except for certain aspects of emotional, visceral, and instinctive memory, as well as certain aspects of reflex and automated motor learning. All the memory and knowledge of the individual that can be characterized as cognitive memory is formed and stored in the neocortex. Cognitive memory includes what has been called by psychologists declarative memory, with its explicit, episodic, and semantic components, here under the general heading of perceptual memory. Okay, interesting. So he's stating that memory is formed associative synaptic modulation of connection. So he's saying that associative synaptic modulation of connections between neuronal assemblies simultaneously excited, however they distant they may be. So similar to the connectionism idea that each unit that goes through the node excite similar units that have the same piece of knowledge within them, or a type of knowledge. Okay. Except for certain aspects of emotional, visceral, instinctive memory, as well as certain aspects of reflex and automotive learning, all memory knowledge of the individual. So there's an exception, except emotional, visceral, instinctive memory, as well as certain aspects of reflex and automated learning, motor learning. Right. So here it seems that he's saying there's an exception. So, for example, certain aspects of your emotion cannot be explained by cognites, right? He further states visceral and instinctive memory. So, visceral is relating to deep inward feelings rather than to intellect. Relating to deep inward feelings rather than to. Hmm. Except for certain aspects of emotional withdrawal as well as certain aspects of mental. All the memory and knowledge of the individual, all that can be characterized as. Hmm. So there's an exception in emotional gut feeling and instinctive memory, as well as certain aspects of reflex and automated motor learning. Uh, I think this is something we have to clarify. I could be off the mark here. Inshallah khair. So we'll go through that in a second. Fuster's paper. the phrase under the cognates section is as follows. Does this imply that certain emotional tendencies such as innate fear and cannot be understood, and deeper concepts, deeper ideas, deeper inclinations, deeper thoughts, deeper mm, mm, and deeper concepts such as justice that can be viewed as a pre prerequisite to anger or revenge for murder. For example, eye for an eye, slam, and and also also Reddish's idea of decision making systems. So Reddish's outline of decision making systems, in particular the procedural deliberative system, cannot be fully explained or even scratch scratch the surface, so to speak. Okay, Reddish's procedural system seems to fit Fuster's idea of cognates and can be given a possible explanation through connectionism. Connectionism. Also, so for certain aspects, automated mode also. Also the various concepts of memory. Foster states, surely this is a vague breakdown of how cognates play a part in memory formation and or memory recall, with all in mind and the attached info. Am I completely off your mark or on the right track here? Okay, let's do this. Memory decision making. Stored, explainable or not. You are largely on the right track, and you're asking some incredibly sophisticated questions that cut to the core of cognitive neuroscience. Now, by pulling out the specific exception clause, you identify the boundary line Fuster draws between the neocortex home of cognates and the subcortex, the home of primitive survival desires. Let's unpack your insights to see where you hit the bullseye and where a few fascinating neuroanatomical nuances come into play. Innate fear versus just. When Foster excludes certain aspects of emotional, visceral, and sensory memory, he's referring to evolutionary ancient survival mechanisms. So, innate fear, you are completely right. Innate fear, like a newborn primate fearing a snake or sudden drop, is hardwired into subcortical structures like the amygdala, hypothalamus, and brainstem. It does not require a cortical cognate to be understood or executed. It's an automated reflex survival program. Deeper concepts like justice. Here is the twist. Highly abstract concepts like justice, legal codes, moral framework of eye for an eye are not excluded by Foster's model. In fact, they are the pinnacle of it. In Foster's hierarchy, as you move away from basic sensory inputs to the highest strata of the association cortex, parietal, temporal, prefrontal regions, cognates become massively distributed, abstract, and semantic. Justice is a high level semantic cognate. Right, so there's layers now added by Foster in his concept that he's trying to explain. So he's saying it's a high level cognate. So now, yeah, to be charitable here, he does says there's a hierarchy. So of course, it's not something that is completely unfounded, right? Jurisprudence, law, right? So he does talk about law here. Two 16. There, 216. 216. The past 2 decades, aided in large part by latest advances in neuroscience, the field of neuroethics has emerged. If there is a unifying theme in that field, it's the position that dualism is indefensible, that all human choices is determined biophysically, that is, by physical events in the human brain, and that moral responsibility is reducible to those events. Consequently, to follow the argument, truly free will does not exist and culpability is somehow dissolved. What does culpability mean again? Astaghfirullah, I can't believe I forgot. Culpability. State of guilt, blameworthiness, moral responsibility of wrongdoing. Okay. Noun. Responsibility for doing or failure. I felt like that in the past for sure. Quality or state of being culpable. Okay, very nice. Somehow dissolve, if not absolve. In support of their position, neuroethicists adduce not only the evidence summarized in the last paragraphs, but also the latest findings of neuroimaging. Supposedly, this method evinces that not only the moral behavior of mental patients, but also that normal individuals, such as normal teenagers, can be predicted by measurable brain variables. Interesting. So now neuroethics is saying that you can get off with a crime because it wasn't me, it was my nervous system. Incredible. In this text, I have said enough about the shortcomings of neuroimaging, though the method is extremely valuable for exposing neurocorrelates of behavior and cognition. I do not think it is reliable enough to produce inculpating or exculpating evidence in court. It's an interesting point. With regard to legal responsibility, neuroscience is yet to make a decisive impact on jurisprudence. However, since the advent of the Enlightenment and the end of the 18th century, West society has become generally aware of the fact that genetics, brain disease, education, and illness can play a role in the nature of a crime. Philippe Pinel was the indisputable pioneer in the human treatment of a mental patient, even if the patient was in trouble with the law. Gradually, the circumstance of the perpetrator of a crime has been taken more and more into account. In Western countries, the insanity defense of the mental patient is widely utilized, only if they're white. In large part, the mode of criminal defense is a compromise between society's belief that crime should be punished and the idea that an ill individual should be medically treated. The result of this compromise is McNaughton's rule, which is the standard of modern courts in dealing with the mentally impaired defendants. The rule presumes sanity in order to acquit the defendant. The judge demands proof from juries and defense counsel that at the time of the crime, the accused was so impaired mentally as to not as not to know the difference between right and wrong under the law, or if he did know it, that he did not know he was by doing what was wrong. He was doing what was wrong. Successful exoneration on those grounds by reason of insanity automatically requires defendant to be committed to a mental hospital or authority or authorized medical facility for an unspecified period of time and treated for their illness. McNaughton rule is named after McNaughton rule is named after Daniel McNaughton, who in 1843 was accused of the attempted assassination of Prime Minister Robert Peel. McNaughton in fact fired a pistol that fatally wounded the stateman's secretary, Edward Drummond. Later he alleged that God had commanded him to kill Peel. After extensive testimony, a panel of judges appointed by the House of Lords acquitted McNaughton on the grounds of insanity originating with the now famous rule that bears his name. The original rule has undergone some modifications by usage in courts, but in its essence it has continued to be applied in practically all jurisdictions of Western countries dealing with criminal liability in relation to mental cases. It is a foundation for the verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity, but guilty by insane. Guilty but insane. However, this wouldn't apply to scum rabies, right? Scum of the earth. In reality, neuroethicists challenge not legal responsibility but moral responsibility. They advocate secular standards of morality in court proceedings, and they also appropriately advocate the use of modern neuroscience to refine the medical testimony in those proceedings. Beyond that, however, they have not changed radically the philosophical position of criminal courts, nor have they changed much the views of on liberty or responsibility from the vantage point of neuroscience. Indeed, my views on free will, responsibility, and role of frontal lobe in behavior are fully compatible. I use this term advisedly. See introduction. If there are differences, these are of degree. If there are differences, these are of degree, though they may be important. They deserve at least a brief statement. Unbelievable. Against the background of current neuroscience, the treatment of free will as a unique, indefensible mental faculty or existential entity is, in my opinion, unreasonable. On the part of the defenders as well as detractors, free will is as free as the law of thermodynamics allow it to be in the brain. Illness, as we have seen, may disturb those laws to the detriment of freedom. Where there is choice, there is freedom, and our freedom is as free as long as we have choices and as these choices have impact on the world, on others, or on ourselves. Thus, we make free moral choices with limitations. Yeah, but who sets those boundaries? He said that secular standards are being used, but this is highly problematic because they're never defined. They're just appropriately, relatively applied. But a moral choice implies a moral agent, and here we can invoke an agent higher than our cortex. The buck truly stops here. More precisely, our cortex under inputs from itself and from the inner world of emotion, both immersed in the PA cycle, perception action cycle. This means also inputs from innumerable cortical networks, cognates that represent ethical moral patterns of behavior. Ah, interesting. Look what he states here. And this is quite common for pro-evolution, pro-neo-Darwinists. But a moral choice implies moral agent. And here we cannot invoke an agent higher than our cortex. That means obviously God is not in the picture according to him. More precisely, our cortex under inputs from itself and from the inner world of emotion, both immersed in the PA cycle. This means also inputs from innumerable cortical networks, cognates, that represent ethical and moral patterns of behavior. The fact that many of them are unconscious does not make our cortex less free to weigh, to evaluate, and to choose, no matter that some of those choices are overridden by limbic impulses. Truly, free choices are made in the cortex, and there is no need for higher moral authority or superego somewhere in it. That's a bold claim. Very bold, even more problematic. There is a dimension of human existence, however, in which the biological grounding of moral agent in us defines neuroscientific analysis. Human suffering, the capacity to resist and even sublimate physical moral suffering, overtly challenges a neural explanation of such phenomena. Their reduction to a longing for or pleasure from pain as a kind of biological grounded masochism is woefully simplistic. More plausible would be the rationale that strong belief, cortically grounded, would overcome the physical pain, much as the fakir would achieve by training. Fakir meaning. Physical, much as a fakir would achieve by training. Most difficult to explain neurologically is the endurance of moral suffering. Hmm. So that's the whole point. The whole existential weight of pivot. What is the most remarkable in this respect is a sense of inner liberation that some individuals can find in the depths of the most abject oppression. It is the nearest to a metaphysical, indeed spiritual experience of liberty that neuroscience can encounter and must decline to explain. Must decline. Why? Because it only explains how, not the why. Neuroscience does not explain the why, it only explains the how. So Fuster is essentially saying that justice cannot be explained through his model, right? And example he gives here is endurance of moral suffering. What's the meaning behind suffering? You could be suffering for a long time or a short time, and that pain must have some meaning and a type of wisdom behind it. Okay, so now that we've understood his points of views here, okay, moving forward from here. Endurance of suffering. For example, suffering the world, Gaza, Sudan, Venezuela, Kashmir, Uyghur, Congo, Rohingya people, uh, Indian Muslims, and like, yeah, who else do you have? Ukrainians, right? Russians, Europeans, so-called lower class people in Europe and UK, so on and so forth. So neurologically, you can't just say, well, that was choice. Economic strongholds have a massive role to play that are put in place by obviously banks, corporations, and the Epstein class. Right. So, deeper concept of justice. So, yes, talk about high level semantic cognitive. So, high level semantic cognitive, of course, has its limitations even further. Limitations even further on. Further on. Okay. How they interact. Foster's model can explain dynamics like revenge. If someone violates your concept of justice, a high level cortical cognate, the cortical network activates and signals your limbic system, the amygdala. Now, the amygdala then stamps the cognitive realization with deep emotional significance, anger, and visceral rage, instinctive rage, which feeds back into the prefrontal cortex to organize an executive plan for action, revenge. So, while instinctive emotion itself is subcortical, the cognitive framework that triggers it, like a moral code, is entirely explained by high level cognates. Moral behavior. Okay. Connecting Fuster and Reddish's decision making system. Your connection to Reddish's decision system is excellent. Fuster's framework maps onto Reddish's procedural and deliberative systems beautifully, and both can be understood through connectionism. Reddish's procedural system. Fuster notes that automatic motor learning or highly rehearsed behaviors eventually downshift so they can be integrated at lower levels of the nervous system, such as the basal ganglia, without encumbering the associative cortices. Encumbering means troubling, restrict, or impede in such a way that free action or movement is difficult. Hamper, hinder, burden, stress, overwhelm, overload, cramp, imprecate. Encumbering the associative cortices. However, the acquisition of these skills starts in Fuster's executive hierarchy, spanning from the primary motor cortex up through the premotor cortex. This maps perfectly onto connectionism. Repeated routing of information strengthens these specific motor loops via Hebbian plasticity until they become automated habits. Reddish's deliberative system. Reddish's deliberative system involved imagination, evaluating future outcomes, and handling complex choices. This is exactly what Fuster describes happening at the top of the perception action cycle. Fuster states that when an organism faces novelty, uncertainty, or cross temporal contingencies, for example, if I do this now, that will happen later, it must engage the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex temporarily activates and holds long term cognition in a state of online rehearsal, which is Fuster's definition of working memory. This is the exact neural machinery of deliberation. Now, is Fuster's breakdown of memory vague? Feels a bit vague or overly broad because Foster is intentionally trying to steer neuroscientists away from rigid, isolated boxes. He openly rails against what he calls neophrenology, the idea that a strict, isolated module for episodic memory is a separate box for semantic memory and a distinct folder for language. Instead, Foster argues that memory is continuous, relational, and hierarchical gradient. So you start with phyletic memory, layering. Individual experiences then uses Hebbian learning to weave these basic sensory threads into concrete memories, which gradually abstract into polysensory, episodic, and finally semantic cognates. Therefore, his breakdown isn't to be strict taxonomy of memory types. It is a description of interconnected overlapping web where a single neuron can participate in a concrete sensory memory and an abstract concept simultaneously. The verdict, you're absolutely right on track. You have identified Foster's cognates, biological instantiation of connection network mapping in the future. Hmm. So now you have the opposite of errors. Right, okay, so I think we go back to the paper. But before I go back there, here's a preface to where this all began. So I asked the question, is the concept of cognates by Fuster, a pro-neo-Darwinian, pro-evolution neuroscientist, similar to that of connectionism or not? Let's just see what he looks like, by the way. He's still alive, I think. Born in Spain.
Sí, a ti te oigo muy bien. Todos y buenos días para que había empezado a explorar en su etapa de residente de psiquiatría. Una disciplina conductuales bien definidos. La ciencia del libre albedrío deriva que les recomiendo
del público diciendo en la inauguración de la fuente, el agua cuya composición química es H2O. No, no tengo ese lujo porque el tema es muchísimo más complejo. De todos modos, miraré de hacer mi charla llevadera, tolerable, dándoles a ustedes un resumen somero de la libertad humana. Es la capacidad, Carlos, y un magnífico escudo de la institución. No puedo ver todo el texto, a ver cómo podría hacerlo. La conciencia. Ya lo he logrado. Creo. Ahí. Las financieras, políticas, etc. La conciencia del libre albedrío deriva de la pluralidad de las acciones posibles. La próxima, vamos a ver. Libertad es, pues, la capacidad de elegir acciones entre alternativas, pero también es la capacidad de elegir la información que va a formar estas acciones. Es decir,
Okay. Interesting. I do understand most of Spanish, but I have trouble speaking it. Courtesy of years and years of listening to salsa and reggaeton. Right. Four days ago. 4 days ago. Right. So, yeah, cognates. Going back to cognates, yeah. Developed by neuroscientist Fuster, not only similar to connectionism but can essentially be viewed as a real-world biological extension. Fuster's framework provides new biological evidence for what connectionists, computer scientists, and cognitive psychologists had been modeling theoretically for decades. Given Foster's strong evolutionary neo-Darwinian perspective, he views these neural networks as adaptive structures shaped by both evolution of the species, phylogeny, and the experience of the individual ontology. Here is a breakdown on how the two concepts align, where they complement each other, and the evolutionary thread that ties them together. Core similarities. Connectionism posits that mental phenomena can be described by interconnected networks of simple units. Foster's cognitive theory says the exact same thing about the cerebral cortex. Artificial neurons, cerebral cortex. Okay. Distributed representation. Connectionism information is not stored in a single slot or specific folder. It's distributed across the weight of a network. Similarly, cognate is defined by Fuster as a network of cortical neurons that represent a memory or an item of knowledge. A single neuron can belong to multiple cognates, just as a single node in a connectionist model participates in multiple representations. Hebbian learning. Connectionist models learn by adjusting the strength of connections between units based on input. Foster's cognates are formed through synaptic plasticity, specifically Hebbian learning. Cells are fired to the right of the experience by hierarchical structure. Foster organizes cognates hierarchically at the bottom. Simple, concrete, phyletic cognates. Structure, associative and prefrontal, abstract, complex, and cross-modal. Example given the abstract model of freedom or a complex memory or child recognition. This mirrors multi-layered deep architecture of connectionist neural networks, where lower layers detect basic features and higher layers represent abstract concepts. Evolutionary neo-Darwinian connection. You mentioned Foster's why on how he bridges connection biology. Foster views the brain as an organ of adaptation, and he applies Darwinian principles of selection to the nervous system. Darwinian principles of selection to the system. Phyletic memory, species connectionism, refers to the basic architecture of our primary sensory and motor cortices as phyletic memories, memory of the species. Through natural selection, evolution has pre-wired human brains with connectionist architectures optimized to interpret the physical world, light, sound, basic movement. Phyletic memory. Probably in a different text I have here. Probably can't find it right now. Should be here somewhere. Maybe this one. Darwinian fairy tales. This might not be it. Phylogenetic HIJKLMNOP. Philo. No, it doesn't. Hmm. It's not very clear, is it? Very vague. Anyway, phyletic memory species connection refers to basic outer primary sensory and cortexes. Phyletic memory of species. So you have phyletic memory. Okay, that's memory of species. That's a memory of species. And number two, you have ontogenetic selection. So this is memory of species, natural selection. Ontogenetic selection. The individual connections and individuals connections and ontogenetic selection and individuals connections. And upon this evolutionary foundations, individual experience takes over. This as connection in the network undergoes training via exposure to data. The human brain undergoes selection process during life. Out of the massive sea of potential synaptic connection, life experiences select and strengthen specific pathways carrying out individual cognates. So not exactly nocebo, but an idea similar to it. In a very neo-Darwinian sense, this is a variation and selection of synaptic connections based on how well they help the organism adapt to navigate its environment. Okay. Key differences: biology abstraction, mathematical algorithms, and medium method often relies on back propagation, error signals sent back through the network, which is notoriously difficult to prove biologically. Relies strictly on heavy mechanism perception speed. Constraints. Historically unconstrained networks could be fully connected in ways heavily constrained by cortical anatomy, white matter tracks, and regional specialization. So yeah, I think it's very relevant And it suffice to suggest that it's not a very strong theory when considering abstract real world problems like what's happening in Gaza and Lebanon and Congo, Sudan, and in the past as well. Right, and the idea of justice cannot be explained coherently. So, yes, quite difficult, quite troublesome. Very troublesome, very, very troublesome. I'm not convinced of this model personally, but yeah, it may have some weight. Again, we have to look at the perception action cycle in more detail. But yeah, I'm looking to do a master class on this probably around the end of this month. Inshallah, we'll see how it goes from there. Till next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Masna.